The letter wasn't thick, just 2 folded pages, no envelope. But it sat in my palm like it had a pulse. I'd found it behind an old radio, the kind that still smelled like wood glue and solder when it warmed up. And by the time I finished reading it, twice actually, I knew the version of my father I'd been carrying in my head was only half the truth. This started last spring, about 3 weeks after we buried him in Ohio. Not even a cold spring, just muddy and too loud with birds. That kind of spring. I'd flown in from Oregon, where I'd been working construction after my divorce finalized, and I hadn't meant to stay long. A few days, help sort the garage, make it easy for his widow to sell. That was supposed to be it. But nothing about that house felt ready to let go of anything. Dad's second wife, Patricia, Pat, had met me at the door with damp eyes and a stack of casseroles people kept bringing over. She'd looked tired in a well-practiced way. "Greg," she said, hugging me with one arm while the other balanced a dish someone had labeled with masking tape. "You look more and more like him every time I see you." That kind of line. What do you do with it? I half smiled and carried in the food. I hadn't seen her in years. She and Dad married when I was in my late 20s. By then, Mom had been dead 6 years. Car accident. Total blur. My father didn't date for a long time. Said he didn't have the heart. Then he met Pat through his church. They got married inside of 9 months. No one asked my opinion. I was busy trying to keep my own marriage from falling apart. By the time I moved out west, I barely called. He barely called me back. We turned into the kind of father and son who just sent birthday texts and swapped Happy New Year messages when it buzzed at midnight. I figured it was mutual. I was wrong. The letter proved that. But before that, there was the house. Always starts with a house. It still smelled like sawdust and old flannel. His recliner was exactly where it always had been, angled just enough to catch the corner of the TV and the fireplace in the same line of sight. The mantel still had photos of Mom, of me as a teenager, even one of all 3 of us on a fishing trip in Michigan. But none of that was in the will. It was a week after the funeral that Pat brought out the documents. We were sitting at the dining table, the same one he used to sand every Thanksgiving morning, just out of habit. She poured coffee into mugs I recognized. Mine had a chipped handle, and I could still see where I'd once scratched the inside with a spoon as a kid. She laid the folder down like it weighed more than it did. "This is everything," she said, not looking at me. The lawyer walked me through it. He left it all to me. The house, the savings, his pension. I thought there might be something set aside for you, Greg, but... She trailed off. No eye contact. I waited. Nothing? She nodded once. "He said you were doing okay on your own, that you wouldn't need anything." I didn't say anything for a long time. The only sound was the clock ticking above the pantry door and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. "Can I see it?" I asked finally. She passed me the folder. There it was, clear as day. Full name, signature, notarized 2 years ago. Not a single mention of me. I didn't argue, didn't yell. What was the point? That night, I lay awake on the guest bed. Same one I'd slept in after prom, during my first breakup, and that weekend after Mom's death, and stared at the same glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck to the ceiling at 16. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I just lay there trying to remember if he ever said anything at all, that made this make sense. The next morning, I started helping Pat clean the garage. There were boxes from before her time, tools I remembered him showing me how to use. A shoebox full of receipts from hardware stores that don't even exist anymore. "Keep what you want," she said. "I don't have use for half this stuff." So I did. I started small. Old fishing tackle. A faded Polaroid of him in front of his first car. Then I found the radio. It was under a sheet, next to his workbench. Heavy, mahogany, late 60s model. I remembered him restoring it when I was 12. I'd handed him screws while he explained how the inner workings operated like a little electrical orchestra. He said I had good hands for detail. I never forgot that. I lifted it up, trying to see if it still worked. Something rattled inside. At first, I thought it was a loose tube or a broken wire, but then I realized it wasn't electrical. There was paper tucked behind the tuner panel. 2 sheets, folded tight. No envelope. Yellowing, but not crumbling. I unfolded them carefully. The handwriting was his, no doubt. Sharp, deliberate letters. The way he used to write birthday cards. It wasn't dated, but the first line read, "If you're reading this, it means I didn't get the timing right, and I'm sorry for that." I read it twice before I sat down. He explained the first marriage. My mother. How much he missed her. How he felt like he failed me by never talking about her more, but that it just hurt too much. He explained the guilt. Said that every time he saw me, he saw her, and it scared him how much he wanted to forget. He said Pat made him feel human again, that he didn't love her the same way, but it was real enough to keep the loneliness away. And then came the twist. I didn't want to leave you nothing. I wanted to tell you in person. I was working on something different. He described an account, not in his will, something private, meant for me. It's not much, but it's yours. Ask Peter. He'll know. Peter, my dad's best friend from work, retired electrician. I hadn't thought of him in years. I looked up from the letter. Nothing in me felt resolved, just opened, like a door I didn't know was locked. I folded the letter again, stuck it in my jacket pocket. When I found Pat in the kitchen, I didn't mention it. I just asked, "You got Peter's number?" She blinked. Why? Just something I found in the garage. Thought he might want it. She gave me the number. I stepped out onto the porch, hands shaking slightly. Not from anger, from something quieter, a kind of restless clarity. I dialed. Peter picked up on the second ring. Greg? I hadn't even said anything yet. He knew. Peter didn't sound surprised when I told him I'd found the letter. He just let out a long breath, like he'd been holding it for a while. I wondered if he ever got around to finishing that thing, he said. I guess he did. I was leaning against the porch railing, jacket unzipped, watching a squirrel bury something in the patch of dirt beneath the dying hydrangeas. My thumb rubbed along the edge of the phone. He said to talk to you about something he set aside. There was a pause. Then, you in town for a few more days? Yeah. Come by tomorrow morning. I'll make coffee. He gave me the address. Still the same little place I remembered from when I was a teenager. He'd lived in that split level outside Gahana with the metal rooster nailed to the garage. I hadn't been there since Dad's retirement party. I slid the phone back into my jacket. Inside, Pat was sorting papers into piles on the dining table. I didn't say anything about the letter, not yet. I told her I'd be out most of the next morning, and she just nodded. Neither of us had much to say anymore. Peter's house hadn't changed much. Same sun-bleached siding, same driveway cracked in 3 places. He opened the door before I could knock, like he'd been watching through the blinds. His hair was grayer than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp. Always had that electrician's squint, like he could see voltage where the rest of us just saw wires. He gave me a firm handshake and a quiet look that said he understood more than he was letting on. We sat in the kitchen. His wife, Beth, had passed a few years back. The space still smelled faintly like lavender, probably from the drawer sachets she used to tuck everywhere. He poured 2 mugs of coffee and pushed one toward me. Your dad talked about you, he said. Maybe not as much as he should have, but he did. I didn't answer. Peter reached for a tin box on the windowsill. One of those old cookie tins that grandmothers keep sewing kits in. He opened it and pulled out a folded envelope. It had my full name written in careful print. Inside was a single key and a handwritten note. Locker 137, East Side Storage. Use it only when you're ready. Dad. The last time I'd been to East Side Storage was with him. I must have been 13. He'd rented a unit there after Mom died, mostly for boxes he didn't want to see but couldn't throw away. He said it was temporary, but everything about grief ends up permanent in a quiet way. The facility hadn't changed much. Still a squat row of rusted red roll-ups. The same humming chain link fence with the keypad that didn't always work on the first try. The guy at the front desk was young, disinterested, chewing something loud. I found the unit halfway down the third row. 137. The key turned easily. Inside, one metal shelving unit, a folding chair, and 6 identical banker's boxes stacked in pairs. Each box was labeled. Each label had a date. The top one read, Greg, 93-95. The rest followed. They weren't legal files. They weren't tax records. They were my life. Or at least, his version of it. Inside the first box were old school projects. A clay dinosaur I made in 3rd grade, still chipped at the tail. Birthday cards I gave him. A VHS of my middle school play. He must have filmed it. My first drawing of our family with stick figures and all of us smiling. The next box, newspaper clippings from my high school baseball games. A sealed envelope with my SAT scores. A photo from prom. Me in that horrible rental tux, standing awkwardly next to Jamie Winslow, who left halfway through the night because she felt sick. My first resume. A scribbled note from Mom on a napkin that said, Greg's handwriting is getting better. And on it went. He hadn't forgotten me. He'd been saving me. The 4th box was heavier. Inside, a thick manila folder with a bank's logo on it. It was an account, a joint one. Opened 5 years ago in both our names. The balance wasn't huge, just under $16,000, but it wasn't nothing. It came with a Post-it. Was going to give this to you the day you moved out west. Didn't get the timing right, but it's yours. There was also a letter, longer than the first, dated 3 months before his death. He talked about regret, about how he handled our distance poorly, about how after I left, he didn't know how to reach across the silence without making it worse. Said he figured I'd resent him for remarrying, that he didn't blame me for pulling away. And then there was a line that knocked the air out of my chest. It wasn't that I didn't want to leave you something. It was that I didn't want my apology to come in the form of a check. I sat there on the concrete floor of that storage unit for over an hour. I didn't cry. Not exactly. But I sat with my hands over my mouth, eyes dry and stinging, just trying to let the weight of it all settle into my ribs. He had seen me, and he'd hidden it, tucked it into boxes, saved it in silence, like a man who thought his love wasn't enough unless it could be proven, and then got scared to prove it. I took everything with me, loaded the boxes into the rental car, drove back to the house, carried them into the room I was staying in. Pat was in the kitchen, on the phone. She watched me through the hallway but didn't ask. I didn't volunteer. Instead, I locked the door to the guest room, set the boxes gently down by the window, and sat on the bed. That night, I opened the 5th box. Inside were old voicemails, saved on cassette. I didn't even know you could do that. One of them was a message I'd left him after my first job interview in Portland. I think I nailed it, Dad, I said, nervous and excited, and trying not to let it show in my voice. Call me when you can. He never did, but he saved the tape. That did something to me I didn't have a name for. The next morning, I confronted Pat. Not angrily, just plainly. I waited until she was pouring cereal. Said, "Did you know he kept a storage unit?" She froze. Spoon midair. No. I told her I had the key, that Peter had given me a note, that I found things. She looked unsure. What kind of things? Things he saved, I said. Of mine, from when I was a kid. She set the spoon down, carefully. I didn't know, she said, voice low. I believe you. She looked down at the table. Then I added, there was a letter about the will, about how he didn't want it to come across like money could fix anything. She was quiet for a long moment. I'm not contesting anything, I said. I just needed to know it wasn't that he didn't stop caring. She nodded once, and then she did something I didn't expect. She stood up, left the room, came back with a small cardboard box. It had my name on it in black marker. I found this in the closet after he passed, she said. Didn't open it. Thought maybe it was private. Inside, a watch. His old watch. The one he wore to every one of my baseball games. Scuffed at the edges, leather band worn to softness. The back was engraved. To Greg. For all the time I missed, and all the time I hope you'll forgive. Dad. I held it in both hands. The room didn't feel angry anymore. It just felt unfinished. The next morning, I wore the watch. It was a little loose. The leather had shrunk over time and cracked in one place, right under where the clasp bent. But it still worked, still ticked. I wound it slowly while sitting at the edge of the guest bed, the sound tiny and mechanical against the larger silence of the house. It felt like time he meant for me to have. Not money, not an apology, just time. A small thing, but it made a difference. I hadn't spoken to Pat again since the box exchange. We weren't avoiding each other exactly. We just didn't know how to stand in the same room without my father standing between us. And maybe we weren't supposed to. I had 3 more days before my flight back to Portland. I figured I'd use that time to make copies of the tapes, digitize the photos, and get the rest of the boxes shipped west. I didn't want to leave them behind. Not again. But something about the whole thing, it still sat sideways in me. Because even if he had meant well, even if he'd been saving those things, why hide them? Why not tell me about the account, or the watch, or anything? Why bury the evidence of care? I didn't have an answer, but I had questions, and not just for him. I called the estate lawyer the next day. He was an older guy named Frank Renner, operated out of a small office above a state farm agency in Worthington. I remembered him from when I was younger. He handled the paperwork when Mom passed, wore thick glasses, and always had a coffee ring on whatever folder he handed you. Greg Andrews, I said over the phone, James Andrews' son. A pause, then, yes, of course. I was sorry to hear. Your father was a good man. Did he ever talk to you about making amendments to the will? Another pause, longer. Well, he did mention it a couple of years ago, asked about adding a secondary account or a letter of intent, but I never received anything formal. I leaned back in the rental car seat, watching the drizzle hit the windshield. Nothing signed? No. He said he wanted to draft something first, something personal. Then he'd bring it in for witness signature. That's usually how these things go. But he never followed through. Not with me, no. That was the word that kept showing up. Timing. He didn't get the timing right. I thanked Renner and hung up. Then I just sat there in the parked car, outside a donut shop, feeling something between grief and irritation claw around in my chest, because love that's hidden might as well be absent. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that storage unit, those boxes, and how he'd saved all that, organized it, but hadn't said a word. I wondered how many times he walked past that unit, knowing he'd never open it with me. How many holidays we sat across from each other making small talk while that account sat untouched. At 2:17 a.m., I pulled the folding chair to the window, cracked it open, and just listened to the wet wind roll across the lawn. Then I started writing. I didn't know what I was trying to say. Maybe I just needed to answer him in some way. So I wrote what I would have said if I'd known sooner. I told him I hated how quiet we'd both gotten. I told him I forgave him, not in a clean way, but in the way that keeps you breathing. I wrote until the sun started coming up. Then I folded the pages, slid them into one of the boxes, and labeled it, Dad. Read when ready. On my last full day in Ohio, I went to see my mother. Her grave, I mean. It was a small plot on the east side of Columbus, just off Broad Street. I hadn't visited in years. The grass had overgrown a little. The stone was clean, though. Someone had been keeping it up. I didn't know if it was Pat, or someone from the church, or maybe Peter, but it felt looked after. I sat down on the little stone bench beside it and just existed there for a while. No speech, no dramatic moment. Then I told her what I found, about the boxes, the tapes, the letter, the will, all of it. And I said the part I hadn't said to anyone. I think he was ashamed, not of loving me, but of how late he realized he hadn't said it. I touched the headstone with 2 fingers. Then I left the watch there, just for a minute, long enough to let the weight shift. Then I put it back on. The airport was uneventful. Pat drove me. We didn't say much on the way there. NPR played low on the radio. She wore sunglasses even though it was overcast. Right before I got out of the car, she handed me something, an envelope. I found this in one of his dresser drawers, she said. Didn't read it. Thought maybe you should. I nodded and slipped it into my backpack without opening it. She looked like she wanted to say something else. Maybe a goodbye. Maybe an apology. Maybe nothing. I said, "Thanks for letting me find him." She swallowed hard. "You're welcome." I walked into the terminal. Didn't look back. On the flight home, I read the new letter. It was dated just a few weeks before he died. Greg, I hope you'll forgive how I handled everything. I hope you'll find what I left for you. I wasn't good at showing it, but I want you to know something plainly. You were the best thing I ever made. I was proud of you. Always, even when I didn't say it. It ended with, "Don't bury yourself the way I did. Love louder." I folded the letter and put it in the same pocket as my boarding pass. I didn't cry, but I felt something shift in me that had been stiff for a long time. Something about being seen, even if late, even if not perfect. I didn't open the boxes again for almost a month after I got back to Portland. They sat in the corner of my apartment, stacked neatly beside the coat rack I barely used. I'd meant to unpack them the week I returned, but life just sort of resumed. Slowly, reluctantly. Construction sites don't wait for emotional clarity. The crew was behind on 2 projects, one in Beaverton, one closer to downtown, and I had to jump back in like nothing had happened. Steel doesn't care if your dad wrote you a letter 3 years too late, but every night when I walked in the door, the boxes were there. Quiet, patient, like they knew I'd come back to them eventually. It was a Sunday afternoon when I finally cracked open the last one. Rain again. A slow Pacific Northwest kind of rain that doesn't stop so much as pause between rhythms. I'd just finished meal prepping for the week. Grilled chicken, brown rice, glass containers that fogged up the counter. I brewed a mug of black tea, sat on the floor with the last box beside me, and peeled the lid off like I was unwrapping something sacred. Inside were only 3 items. A slim, leather-bound notebook, a small wooden box with a clasp, a sealed envelope with "Open when you're ready to forgive me," written in pencil. I froze. The letter I found in the garage hadn't said anything about this. Neither had Peter. This one felt final. I left it sealed. For now. Instead, I opened the notebook. It wasn't a diary, not exactly. More like a running list of memories. Each page held a fragment. Just a date and a line or 2. Some were barely legible. Others were written so clearly I could picture him hunched over a workbench, taking his time. July 18th, 1993. Greg's first scraped knee. Didn't cry. Just looked at me like I'd let the sidewalk win. May 3rd, 1997. Science fair. His volcano erupted too early. Still proud. Said, "At least it worked." March 22nd, 2004. The way he stared out the passenger window. Said nothing after the college visit. Didn't know if he was scared or bored. Probably both. October 10th, 2007. "Don't worry about me," he said when I told him I was moving west. Still looked like it hurt. He shook my hand too long. There were dozens of them. Tiny windows into moments I thought only I remembered. A few were about Mom. December 4th, 2001. Found him staring at her photo for too long. Said he didn't hear me come in. I think that was true. Some pages were blank. Others had just one word. Regret. Quiet. Waited. I didn't realize how long I'd been reading until the tea went cold in my mug. The wooden box was next. Inside, cufflinks, his church pin, a photograph of the two of us when I was maybe 9, me holding a fish too small to keep, grinning like I'd caught a shark. Taped to the bottom of the box, a folded scrap of notebook paper. None of this makes up for absence. I know that. But if you're reading this, it means you looked. You came back. That's something. I set the photo down and finally picked up the envelope, the one marked, "Open when you're ready to forgive me." I hesitated. I didn't feel ready, but I didn't feel like keeping it sealed either. I broke the seal slowly. Inside, just a single paragraph, typed this time, printed neatly. Greg, forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about making space for a different version of it to live beside you. I spent too many years thinking that silence was safer than imperfection, that if I couldn't fix things neatly, I shouldn't try. I realize now that you deserved a father who tried anyway. I'm sorry for the distance, for the delay, and for the cowardice I mistook for restraint. I sat there, envelope in hand, while the sun shifted behind the clouds and left the room gray. And then I just said it, out loud to no one. I forgive you. A week later, I called Peter. He answered like he'd been expecting me. "So," he said, "you get through all of it?" "Yeah," I said, "all of it." There was a pause, then the creak of what sounded like a chair. "Your dad had a hard time with vulnerability. You know that." "I do now." He didn't know how to talk about guilt, but he kept trying in the ways he could. I nodded into the silence. "Thanks for keeping it safe." "That was the easy part," Peter said. "The hard part was not telling you sooner." "Why didn't you?" "He asked me not to, said you had to find it on your own, that you wouldn't believe it unless it came from him in his way." He was right. A month later, I went back to the unit, closed it down. I digitized everything, scanned the photos, transcribed the tapes, cataloged the documents. I'd even started a private online folder labeled "What Dad Saved." But the physical space? It needed to rest now. I stood there for a long minute before pulling the door shut, listening to that metallic roll-down clatter. Then I turned in the key. It didn't feel like closure. That's too clean of a word. It felt like real life, messy, unspoken, partially healed. But mine now. Back in Portland, I took the watch to a local repair shop. The guy behind the counter had long fingers and soft eyes. "This is good craftsmanship," he said. "Want me to condition the band too?" "Please." I told him I wore it every day now, not because I wanted to show it off, but because I wanted to remember to show up, to not wait too long. That weekend, I went hiking with a friend from work. First time I'd said yes in a while. We took a quiet trail east of Mount Hood, the kind with pine needles so thick they muffle your steps. Midway through, we sat on a fallen log to rest. "You okay?" he asked. "Getting there," I said. I didn't explain, just looked at the sky through the trees, and let it be enough. It's strange how grief doesn't have a loud ending. I used to think it would. Something cinematic. A breakdown, maybe. A conversation where everything spills out and then the camera fades to black. But that's not how it goes. Sometimes grief just sits down beside you at breakfast and stays quiet while you read your email. Sometimes it rides shotgun and doesn't say a word while you listen to the same playlist over and over. Sometimes it just hums along while you refill your gas tank, or stand in line for coffee, or wash a plate you don't remember dirtying. But eventually it softens. Not because anything gets fixed, but because you learn how to carry it. And that's what I think my father never figured out. A few months after I closed the storage unit, I got a letter in the mail. It was from Pat. Short. 3 pages, handwritten, neat. She'd sold the house. Said it had been too big, too quiet. She moved into a condo in Grove City. Smaller place, near a park she liked. She sounded better, lighter. But the part that caught me off guard was this. I found something else of your father's while packing. Something I think he meant for you to have. I wasn't sure at first, but after everything, I think it's right. She'd included it in the envelope. A folded sheet of lined paper, dated 5 years back. A rough draft of a letter, maybe, or a note he never sent. It read, "Sometimes I worry that Greg thinks I moved on too quickly after his mother. The truth is, I never really moved on at all. I just got tired of crying in the same chair every night. Pat helped me remember how to laugh at bad TV again. That was all. But Greg, he was always the one who held the better parts of her. I see her in him. I always have. I just didn't know how to say it without breaking in half." I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the paper getting damp in my hands. I set it on the table and just sat with it. Like sitting with him. I called Pat the next day. We talked for over an hour. Not just about him, about everything. She asked if I was seeing anyone. I told her about someone I'd started talking to, a woman named Lena, a friend of a friend, someone who loved dogs and didn't mind silence. Pat laughed and said Dad would have liked her. I believed her. Before we hung up, she said something that stuck with me. "You're more like him than you realize." I didn't say anything to that. But later, I thought about it. And for the first time, it didn't sting. The following weekend, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I went fishing. Just me, an old rod I dusted off from storage, and a lake about 40 minutes outside the city. It wasn't fancy. No boat. Just a quiet spot on the bank. The kind where the wind carries stories if you sit still long enough. I didn't catch anything. Didn't even really try. But I brought a picture of Dad with me. One of us from the tackle box in the unit. I propped it up on a small rock beside my thermos. Let him watch the water with me for a while. And somewhere between casting and reeling, I said it again. Not for closure, just for truth. I forgive you. I still wear the watch. The band fits better now. Got it resized. Sometimes people ask me about it. I just say it was my dad's and leave it at that. But sometimes, on quieter days, I tell them more about the boxes, the letter, the silence, and the way love doesn't always look like we expect it to, but it doesn't mean it wasn't there. I still don't have answers for why he left me out of the official will, why he couldn't say the things he wrote down. But I don't need the answers as much anymore, because what I got was the part he was brave enough to give in the end. And maybe that's the part that mattered most. If this story moved you, subscribe for more real-life confessions and emotional journeys like this one.